So now we're going to move to the last speakers of this session before the final remarks about involving patients in the discussion. So we call Lauren Roberts and Louise James. Lauren and Louise are part of the Genetic Alliance UK. Mrs. Roberts is the Director of Support at Genetic Alliance UK, which is an alliance of 200 patient organizations that work to improve lives of patients and families affected by genetic conditions. She developed a very interesting project called the Swan UK about the syndrome without a name, the undiagnosed genetic conditions, and this program also welcomed Mrs. James, who is a volunteer parent within this Swan UK project, and she had 3 children, and the youngest had an undiagnosed genetic syndromes. So please, you have the floor to talk about it, about involving the patients in these regards, because obviously they are the first concerned by the technology.
So as mentioned, I work for a charity called Genetic Alliance UK, and we are an alliance of 200 organisations who work with patients affected by genetic conditions and their families. We also, the bit in pink, we run the Swan Uk Project, and this is support for families who have children and young people who are suspected to have a genetic condition, but all the testing comes back inconclusive. So most of these children are taking part in whole genome sequencing research projects. And we also run the Rare Disease UK campaign, which is a policy campaign specifically focused originally on developing and getting a strategy for rare diseases in the UK, and is now looking at the implementation of that plan. So the subject of genome editing and all of the things you've been talking about today is something that's very real and of massive interest to the patients that we work with. So what we want to do today is just to give you a really quick overview of some of the work we've already done, to give you an idea of what patients are telling us, and also to tell you about some recommendations that we have around some about how to talk about genome editing so that patients can be involved in these really, really complex discussions. So we did a report in 2016 where we sent out a survey to our members, and we had 150 responses, and we asked people to think about the different kind of situations in which genome editing might be used. And from this, we just pulled together an overview of what they were thinking about this. Was it something they were interested in? Is it something they were worried about? Was it something that they thought could offer hope to rare disease patients? 80% of rare diseases are genetic, so this is something that potentially could have a huge impact on the community we work with. And you can see here that actually the general gist of what they told us was that this is something they're very, very interested in. They were very clear that they thought this should only be used within medical treatments. It wasn't something they thought should be more widely available for things like just, sort of enhancement of healthy humans. They didn't think it should be used for just kind of, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but the aesthetics of enhancing human life. But it was something that could offer real hope to rare disease patients, but that this needed to be really tightly regulated. They wanted to make sure that patients were protected within this, and patients weren't just being used and their hopes for a cure being used by scientists who are maybe slightly unscrupulous, but also that they wanted to be able to really take part in this discussion, and they wanted to make sure that their views were listened to. So following on from this, we did another piece of work which was funded by the Wellcome Trust and in partnership with the Progress Educational Trust, who lent me a lot of these slides for today, so I'm very grateful. And we ran a series of workshops exploring with patients how best to talk about these really complex issues. And in a moment, I'm going to run you through the recommendations that we had from this report. I've also got some copies with me that I'll leave on the side if you want to take one with you, and they're available on our website as well. But just before I talk to you about those recommendations, I'm going to hand over to Louise, who took part in the workshop. She's up there on the right-hand side. And she's just going to tell you a little bit about her personal situation and what it was that led her to get involved in these workshops and how she found that.
Hello, as Lauren introduced, I'm Louise, and this in the picture is my son, Scott. We refer to him as Scotty, and he is 8 years of age. So last year I was invited, along with other rare disease patients, to take part in these genome editing workshops. Very little expectations of what I was going to understand. We arrived at the first workshop and we were presented with newspaper articles. And these newspaper articles were what we see in the press every day. They spoke about all the scary stories that can happen with genome editing, the designer baby, the Jurassic Park side, and then all of a sudden there was this small article about a little girl who had been cured of her leukemia. And as a patient, at this point, I couldn't believe that these were the stories that the general public would be seeing, the scary side of it. They wouldn't be seeing the impact of living with a rare disease and the things that could happen. As I said, Scott is 8 years old. He has a genetic syndrome. I can't change that. You can't change that. He was born with that. And actually, he has of great value to society. He has the ability to learn, and albeit differently from us, I learn a lot from him. But he does have a small part of his DNA that means he has complex seizures so bad that they impact his ability to breathe sometimes. They impact his ability to develop. They impact his ability to learn. They mean that he has to sleep for hours on end. They mean that he can't travel next week with his two big sisters to see Mickey Mouse in Florida, despite it being his most favourite character. They mean that every time I put him to bed at night, he is at risk of sudden death. And later on in the workshops, I began to understand the importance of talking about genome editing in the press. I began to understand the importance of these things where you all discuss things that I will never understand. I don't need to understand, I just need reassurance that there are brilliant people working on all the things that frighten the public about what can happen with genome editing. But I don't expect you to understand what it's like living every day with a rare genetic syndrome, the impact that has on our lives and on Scott's life and the lives of thousands of others. But I do know that this technology can possibly mean that that tiny bit of DNA can be removed and that Scott's quality of life could potentially be improved. I don't need to fix him, he's not broken. I need to improve his quality of life. I need him to go and see Mickey Mouse with his sisters. I need him to go to school to be the best that he could be. And I know that this technology can do that. So I just need you to think that when you're doing all these brilliant things and all these slides that I will never understand, I need you to think about Scott and the impact it can have on him and how it can change his life and the lives of thousands of other patients.
She's always an impossible act to follow. I always think, what am I supposed to say now? But just to take it back to the workshops that Louise was talking about, these are the reports that we came up with. And we basically just put together a guide of recommendations of how you can involve patients or carers like Louise in these discussions so that they do feel that they're part of this, because there's so much complexity that needs to be worked out, and that's why it's brilliant to see this happening today. But at the same time, nobody can talk as powerfully about this as Louise and other patient advocates like her. So it's for everybody's benefit to have them involved in these discussions right from the start. So very simply, make sure that people understand what you're talking about. You know, make sure they understand the difference between genome sequencing and genome editing. Start from the basics. Do they understand what a genome is? One of the things that came out of the workshops was that actually people thought a genome was smaller than a gene because it had ome at the end, and that sounds like it should be smaller. So actually, don't run ahead before you can walk. Do people know what you're talking about? Make sure that they do understand what a genome is, they understand what sequencing is, they understand what editing is, and know that you might have to keep checking back on this with them. And that doesn't mean that they can't understand the bigger issues. It just means it gets confusing talking about these two different terms. As we said, you need to explain what a genome is. Make sure you use the same term consistently. So for us, it's always genome editing, because this was the one that in the workshop people seem to grasp the most. Don't talk about engineering. Don't talk about gene editing. People will think you're talking about different things. So just stick very, very consistently to that one term. And if we can all use that, then that helps for that clarity straight off. So people don't spend 10 minutes listening to your presentation thinking, oh, this is something different to the thing that I learnt about last time. We discovered that really simple metaphors work well: cut and paste, find and replace. And actually that was more effective than some of the big elaborate metaphors that are often used when you're talking about genome sequencing around libraries and books and letters and that kind of thing, and spelling mistakes. It's not all about CRISPR. And actually one of the biggest things that came out of this is that it's really important actually to not conflate CRISPR with genome editing. They are different things. So when you're talking to patients, when you're talking to the public, what you want them to know is, what's a genome? Oh, sorry, that doesn't look very pretty. What's genome editing? What can genome editing do? And potentially just stop there. If you do need to get into what's CRISPR and what's CRISPR-Cas9, think very carefully before you start having those discussions with patients, and even the public, I would answer, because they don't need to understand the technicalities of how that works to be able to be involved in those first 3 questions. So also make sure that you're really clear about the context of what you're talking about. So all of the things that have been talked about today, that's huge. You know, best brains in the world are muddling this through. That's a lot for the public or a patient to be involved in. But they can still take part in very specific discussions, and make sure they understand this difference between germline or not, and make sure they understand what germline means. And I think just from conversations I've had in the last week with people, there's a lot of fear around that. So it's really important to be distinguishing between what can happen now and what would need to be changed in terms of the regulatory framework to happen in the future. That's it. Thank you very much.